Big Mom is coming to Elbaf. In the One Piece fandom, there's a lot of people who think that Big Mom will not make a return to the story, and I want to use this video as a sort of pushback against these people because I really do think Big Mom does have a place left in the story, and that's exactly what this video is going to be talking about. Today's video is going to talk about why people think Big Mom is done with the story, all the evidence that she's coming back into the story, and the purpose or the role she'd play in the story when she does come back into the Elbaf arc. If you stick around to the end of this video, I truly do believe you'll share my opinion that Big Mom is going to come back into the story and have a huge impact on Elbaf. So if you do make it to the end, make sure to like and subscribe and let me know if you agree with everything I say. So why do people think Big Mom is done in the story? Well, the first most obvious thing is that people think she's dead, which I guess is fair because the end of Wano really did feel like the end of her character in some ways, and it really did feel like she died in that hole underneath Onigashima. But before we get into why thematically I don't think that was the end of her character, let's talk about logistically how Big Mom did not die there. Now I know a lot of people call this copium, but I do not think Big Mom fell into the same lava that Kaido fell into. If you look at the hole that Oda drew that both Kaido and Big Mom fell into, there are two separate holes. And earlier on in the arc, in this exact same diagram fashion, we found out that the hole that Big Mom fell into is pretty much the exact same hole that falls down into the port that you're supposed to use to get into Wano. So rather than falling into the lava like Kaido did, I think Big Mom fell down into this hole down to the port that exits Wano, and of course who was waiting down there for her? Her crew, which Marco kicked down to the waterfall, so her crew would be perfectly waiting there for her, and would be able to rescue her after Law and Kid kind of packed her up. Now to that, I know a lot of people would say, but we saw Big Mom and Kaido in the lava after Wano. They literally burned and then got exploded out of a volcano. Well, there's two different responses I have to this. The first is a little bit of copium, and that is that this picture of Big Mom and Kaido burning in lava is actually just Kaido. It's very hard to tell what these silhouettes are actually depicting, as they usually are in One Piece because Oda really doesn't know how to draw silhouettes. But I truly do think that this is either Kaido and his jacket, or Kaido somehow got beheaded and his head is gigantic for some reason, but I think the more likely option is that this is Kaido and his jacket. But just for the sake of arguing, let's assume that this is Big Mom and Kaido and they're both burning in the lava together, and they both got exploded out of that volcano. Well, we do know all the way back from Skypiea that Sky Islands are created with the ash from volcanic eruptions, so it is very likely that both Kaido and Big Mom lived and are on a Sky Island, had this both been them burning in the lava. But like I said before, I do not think Big Mom fell in the lava. I think she fell down the hole where the port was and her crew rescued her. So hopefully that's enough to convince you why logistically Big Mom is still alive, but let's talk about thematically. Why is it okay for her character to return in the story from a character writing standpoint? Well, I think the first and most obvious point here, going back to Wano, is just her final words after the Law and Kid fight. I think there's some juicy exposition about the One Piece and her relationship with Roger in her falling down into this hole, and I feel like her saying this isn't enough to do her in is kind of just a straight indicator that she's going to come back into the story. I feel like it'd be a strange choice for Oda to make these her final words just for her to not come back, especially when both Law and Kid are also in kind of the same uncertain state right now, which we'll get into later into the video, but I think this was a deliberate choice from Oda to set up for her to come back later in the story. But on top of that, I also think all the way back to her backstory in Whole Cake Island is showing us that there's unfinished business between her and Elbaf. And of course, now that we're in the Elbaf arc, I truly do believe there's a stage for her to come back and wrap up her character completely. Whether or not she's going to be an antagonist in the arc and try and attack the island she once had a relationship with, or she's going to turn a new leaf and try and salvage her relationship with the Giants, I'm not sure, but I do think that the fact that her character was established and created with ties to Elbaf creates a large stage for her to return in this arc. I do not think her character is over. But maybe you don't care about the logistic and thematic reasons for Big Mom to return to the story, and you just want evidence. Well, we already talked about her final words, and we already talked about her ties to Elbaf, but there is actually a lot more evidence that shows us that Big Mom is going to return to the story, so let's take a look at that. And the first is that we've got multiple mentions of Big Mom in Elbaf already this Elbaf arc. I really do not think it is just a simple coincidence that the Giants are mentioning Big Mom a lot in this arc. I feel like if Oda was done with Big Mom, he wouldn't even have made the choice to include her in the dialogue in this arc, and I think this is a big indicator. The first example of this is when the Giants mentioned that they're happy that the Straw Hats defeated her in Wano. Again, I really do not think there was any purpose to include this panel at all, if not for a potential Big Mom comeback, or for her to have a potential impact in the story in the future of this arc. But if you weren't convinced with one appearance of Big Mom in the Elbaf dialogue, this recent chapter had two big connections with Big Mom. The first is when a new giant pirate warrior uses a shield to block an attack from this dinosaur, and it is a homie from Big Mom, which he got from his father who clashed with Big Mom. Again, I think this is such a weird thing to include if Big Mom wasn't going to have an impact on the future of the arc. Especially that the Straw Hats relate this to Zeus, who now works for Nami. To me, this absolutely indicates that there is something going on here and Big Mom will potentially have a return. But the even bigger connection in the most recent chapter is that we got to see Rox talk with Loki, and if you don't remember, Big Mom was a part of the Rox Pirates, and since we see Edward Newgate or Whitebeard here with Rox, that means Big Mom was also on Elbaf in the past. Rox being on Elbaf at a certain point in his life and having an interesting relationship with Loki means he's going to have a big impact on the arc, undoubtedly, and Big Mom by proxy is just a part of that crew. It just is another gigantic thread of connections to make Big Mom appear in Elbaf again. I feel like this is not a coincidence at all. And lastly, the biggest piece of evidence that I think a lot of people glossed over because they thought it was referring to Loki is when Ripley says that Elbaf's greatest weakness is fire and lightning. We know, of course, that Big Mom's powers are both heavily based on fire and lightning, and the fact that it is Elbaf's greatest weakness means that if she comes back into the story, into Elbaf specifically, she could prove as a really good antagonist for the Straw Hats to fight, or for somebody to fight in Elbaf, because she will put the whole island in danger. Which brings me to my next and final point. If Big Mom was to come back into Elbaf, what purpose would she serve? Why would she come back into the arc anyway? Is she even important for the story? I think I have a lot of good answers for that. I'm just going to go through them one-on-one, and if Big Mom does return, you let me know which you would like her to serve as a role in the story. Starting with the one I personally would like to see, and that is a hype tool for Luffy to defeat a Yonko one-on-one. So far in the story, despite now being a Yonko himself, we can't really say Luffy has defeated a Yonko one-on-one entirely on his own. The fight against Kaido required so many hands to help him, and although I think Luffy could possibly defeat Kaido in a one-on-one now, I think it's a little bit of a disservice that we haven't got to see Luffy fight a Yonko one-on-one completely and win. So if Big Mom returns and someone has to stop her from destroying Elbaf, it would be a great opportunity for Luffy to finally defeat Big Mom in a one-on-one, and it also means Luffy would not be going back on his word, what he said in Punk Hazard, where he said he would beat every single Yonko. Luffy didn't even have a chance to fight against Big Mom in Wano, so I think this would be absolutely perfect. Similar to that, number 2 is it is a potential way to get Kid back into the story. We know Big Mom and Kid have extreme beef. Big Mom's last words before falling into the hole in Wano were that she's gonna get back at Kid in Law. And I seriously don't think Kid is out of the story yet. Similar to Big Mom, I don't think Oda would just discard him completely. I think he has a staged return in Elbaf. And if Big Mom does the same, it could be a potential way for Kid to get revenge, or for him to come back into the story and be a savior for the Giants if he's the one who saves Elbaf from Big Mom's rage. The third is that she would have incredible knowledge about Rox, and her exposition could tell us a lot about his character before we get the God Valley flashback. Of course, in this chapter, like I mentioned before, we know Rox visited Elbaf, which has huge implications on the story. So if Big Mom comes back, and perhaps after she's defeated and is able to just give us a little bit of dialogue, she could tell us why the Rox pirates went to Elbaf in the first place, and we would find out a lot more about that crew. And lastly, I think it would just wrap up her character for good. I feel like a lot was established for Big Mom in both Whole Cake Island and Wano, and the way she was defeated was cool, but it was a little lackluster for her character. I think it'd be cool to see her wrap up her character arc, either coming to terms with the Giants and deciding to live there peacefully, or going down in a flaming and burning pile of wreckage and she dies. I feel like there needs to be some kind of conclusion for her character, because the conclusion for her character in Wano wasn't exactly a conclusion, so I would like to see her return. So, those are all my reasons why Big Mom's gonna return, and the purposes she'll have in the story when she does return. Let me know if you agree with any of these points, or if there's anything I missed. If you think Big Mom's gonna have a completely different role in the story, but she will return, let me know. I'm curious to see if there's anything that I didn't mention. And if you like this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you next time.